I'm delighted to see such a nearly full house, big crowd here tonight. We never know in the winter months, and we're now relaunching our programming for the new semester, the winter/spring semester, and it's good to be kicking off with a big group. Today's discussion of urban life in the age of climate change is part of our Humanities at Large program. So it's not directly connected with our annual thematic series, which, as a lot of you know, is on afterlives this year, directed by Emily Wilson. The Afterlife series is going to resume tomorrow evening with Christina Crosby and her partner Janet Jacobson discussing Crosby's really harrowing and kind of incredible memoir of life after a horrific spinal cord injury, bicycle accident, spinal cord injury. The book is called A Body Undone, Living On After Great Pain. And that discussion, which is the Argene Brownlee Lecture for 2018, is up in the McNeil Center on 34th and Walnut Street. And that starts at 5 p.m. tomorrow. And that is part of our Afterlives series, a program which then continues next Wednesday, the 31st, with the first screening in our Afterlives film series. The series is called Reviving and Reviewing the Race Film, and the film is Blood of Jesus from 1941, Spencer Williams' film. And there'll be opening remarks from Iggy Cortez of Cinema Studies. He's the co-curator of that series. So we've got these Afterlives things coming up. This is where we are in our Wolf winter calendar. However, the distinction between the thematic programming and the at-large programming can get pretty blurry, even in my own mind, maybe especially in my own mind. And this is one of those times. If the vagaries of funding and scheduling had fallen out differently, we certainly could have lodged this evening's event under the thematic umbrella of Afterlives. Ashley Dawson's latest book, Extreme Cities, which is available for sale out in the foyer here, and which Ashley will be available to sign after the presentation and conversation tonight. Ashley's book makes abundantly clear that the social, economic, political, and environmental arrangements that structure the lives of human individuals and communities in some of the world's most important cities cannot and will not continue. That way of life, our way of life, is effectively over. The question now is what kinds of afterlives are possible. I want to thank our co-sponsors, Dan Garofalo of Penn Sustainability. Is Dan here? There he is. Hi, Dan. Dan and Bethany Wiggin, professor of German and the director of the Penn program in Environmental Humanities. I had the good fortune to work alongside Bethany last year. Many of you, I know, came to some of the events in our terrific program on translation that Bethany organized and directed. So this is kind of a reunion for us to be partnering up again as co-sponsors tonight. I can't think of any other area of interdisciplinary research that presents such urgent challenges and opportunities as the environmental humanities. All of us at Penn owe a debt to Bethany for her determined and inspiring leadership of Penn's EH program. Bethany is going to introduce Ashley Dawson and Professor Cohen. Please give her a round of applause, and she'll do the introductions.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for being here tonight. I'm a little shorter than Jim, so bear with me. It is truly a real pleasure to be with you today with the Wolf Humanities Center to introduce Professors Dawson and Daniel Aldana Cohen. Jim and the Wolf Humanities Center are really terrific friends and collaborators with the Penn program in environmental humanities. And as you just heard from Jim, this event represents something of a homecoming for me and for PPEH. Last year, I worked closely with Jim as the topic director of the Penn Humanities Forum in that year on translation. Of course, as you just heard, the forum has been bodied forth into the afterlife as the Wolf Humanities Center. And as I was reflecting on that and my year this morning, I actually thought of Flannery O'Connor's character Hazel Motes. And Hazel preached, "Where you came from is gone, where you thought you were going to never was there, and where you are is no good unless you can get away from it." I came back to O'Connor's novel Wise Blood recently after reading Natasha Trethewey's Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Hazel's words, delivered from the hood of his car, a sermon in his Church Without Christ, lend the epigraph for Trethewey's collection of poetry and essays. In the prologue, Trethewey reflects on her poem Theories of Time and Space, written some 10 years earlier, and included also as the first poem in Beyond Katrina. She explains, quote, "I had intended to consider the impossibility of returning to those places we've come from, not because the places are gone or substantially different, but because we are." She continues, registering that in the decades since she wrote that poem, quote, "It has become quite literal. So much of what I'd known of my home was either gone or forever changed. After Katrina, the words I had looked to for their figurative values gave way to the reality they came to represent." The superstorms, including Katrina and the other extreme weather events, are a signature of contemporary anthropogenic climate change, and they are at the heart of the work of both of tonight's speakers. Ongoing and future climate change are transforming our cities and our planet's systems. They are also, as Trethewey's reflections suggest, transforming how we understand our cultural heritage. Today's warming planet changed Trethewey's reading of her own poem, Theories of Time and Space, and it is changing our relationship to space, time, and our past more globally. Climate changes the humanities themselves. We consider the past and our present heritage through new eyes and with different questions, and we realize we need new tools and trainings to answer them. This year, our annual topic at the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities asks, "How did we get here?" And we look forward to welcoming Professor Dawson tomorrow to join the faculty working group in our ongoing conversations about the kinds of intellectual and collaborative tools humanists will need. Before I introduce Professor Dawson's work to you, let me first introduce his interlocutor this evening, Daniel Aldana Cohen. Daniel is a member of the Program in Environmental Humanities Faculty Working Group and an assistant professor in sociology here at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the host of a terrific podcast, I highly recommend it to you, Hot and Bothered, and is at present completing a book entitled Street Fight: Climate Change and Inequality in the 21st Century City. His research takes him regularly to Sao Paulo. His Portuguese is pretty good, I understand, and he is among the first recipients of PPEH's research and teaching seed funds for his project that takes Street Fight to the people via undergraduate researchers and community engagement projects that his award supports. Ashley Dawson is a professor of English at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. He is the author and editor of many books and edited collections, including, to name just the first two, Mongrel Nation, Diasporic Culture, and the Making of Post-Colonial Britain, which appeared in 2007 with the University of Michigan Press. And also, in 2013, the Routledge Concise History of 20th Century British Literature. Ashley Dawson is a longtime member of the Social Text Editorial Collective. He edited Social Text Online from 2010 to 2014, and in 2016, he founded the Social Text Online podcast series. I see a future of podcasting. At present, he is a visiting professor of English at Princeton University, and at Princeton he also holds the Curry C. and Thomas A. Barron Visiting Professorship in the Environment and the Humanities at the Princeton Environmental Institute. In 2016, he published Extinction, A Radical History with O.R. Books, and in 2017, the book which his talk this evening draws from, Extreme City, Climate Chaos and the Urban Future. It was in the research for writing these books, I imagine, that he added new tools to those he developed while training to become a scholar of Anglophone literature. For to the traditional tools of an English professor, rhetoric, methods of literary analysis, as well as social, cultural, and media theory, he has active research areas, as the website of the Princeton Environmental Institute states, in carbon mitigation, energy conservation and technology, environmental conservation, as well as environmental mitigation and policy, to name just a few. Ashley Dawson exemplifies what we might call a climate humanist, to borrow a phrase, both a counterpoint to and a collaborator with climate scientists. For climate has changed the methods and tools of analysis Dawson is using, even as he is still very much a humanist. In closing, let me recall Flannery O'Connor, where you are is no good unless you can get away from it. It is often said that irony is the figure of our age, a truism perhaps, but once again proven in the ways our past, no less than our future, can seem uncanny or unheimlich, unhomely, or even inhospitable, to translate more literally from the German. Dawson's recent work suggests future trajectories for the humanities more broadly as we grapple with climate change and the well-known list of things we might also want to get away from. But now, let's get you to Ashley Dawson and then also to Daniel Aldana Cohen.
It's great to see you all here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that's going to happen. I will make some introductory remarks, which I will try to be very disciplined and keep to a pretty tight amount of time. Then Daniel and I will have a conversation. But before I launch in, I wanted to thank Jim and Bethany for their incredibly generous comments to start things out. It's a real honor to be here. I'm super excited. And I also wanted to thank Paul and all the other staff associated with the Wolf Center and the Environmental Humanities for making it possible for me to come here. The logistical support has been just wonderful. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Extreme Cities. This is Miami, downtown, last September. When it was hit by a hurricane. Florida was given a fairly glancing blow, but nonetheless was affected by the hurricane season. And so I think it gives you a kind of visual sense of some of the things that I'll be talking about. Cities, the central argument of my book goes, are the kind of real keystone for climate change, ground zero for climate change, if you will. And urban sustainability is integrally connected to issues of urban social equity. I mean, that's the real kind of central point of my argument. It may seem a bit strange to be arguing this, though. Isn't, after all, climate change a global phenomenon, right? When we talk about climate change, we talk about it in kind of planetary terms. Doesn't it affect the entire atmosphere? The oceans, the soils, as well as, of course, the planetary atmosphere. Yes, that's certainly true, but cities are responsible for over 70% of carbon emissions. So with heating, cooling, the urban built environment, generating about 35 to 45% of carbon emissions globally, as well as urban industries and transportation, contributing 35 to 40%. So cities are really the kind of driver of global climate change in many ways, at least the lion's share of the emissions of carbon that are driving climate change. And I have a couple of images that I hope will help to make that clear. This thing doesn't seem to be working. Ah, there we go. No, I must have pushed something. Sorry, whenever technology cannot work, it will definitely not work. Let me see if I can get this back up. And There we go. OK. So this is 1 hour of New York City's carbon dioxide emissions, with 33 metric tons being represented by one of those balloons right next to the Empire State Building. This was done during the sort of tail end of the Bloomberg administration, so relatively recently. Emissions have gone up since then. And this is 1 day of New York City's carbon emissions, just to give you a sense, kind of a visual sense of what's happening in cities. And of course, one of the difficult things about climate change is that it's, in many ways, hard to actually see, hard to make visible. So one of the jobs, I think, of humanists and of artists and other people who are trying to be aware of the science, but also communicate to people out there, is to do this sort of thing, to find ways to actually visualize climate change. And in this case, I think there's a really strong sense of how it's happening in cities. In addition to generating carbon, cities are also being highly affected by climate change. I hope this isn't going to keep happening if I'm pressing the wrong button or something. OK. Yeah. This is a graph that gives you a sense of the urban heat island effect. So you can see in rural areas and suburban areas on either side of the graph, during both the day and the night, temperatures are much lower than in downtown areas. There's just a lot more kind of concrete, tarmac, and other things that absorb heat and then radiate it back out again during the day. And so that means that cities are about 30% hotter than the countryside, which of course leads to elevated mortality rates when it gets hot. But climate science tends to measure climate change, as I said earlier, on the scale of the planet. And in fact, a lot of data collected from urban weather stations tends to be statistically adjusted, right, so that it's factored in with global averages, which in some ways makes cities invisible, and the kind of heightened conditions that climate change is producing in cities relatively invisible. So I think we need to find ways to make the urban experience of climate change far more visible. All right. At the core of my book is an analysis of the ways in which capitalism is connected to climate change. Capitalism arguably is one of the things that's driving the growth of cities, ever since the 18th century, but particularly in recent years, capitalism has been creating a phenomenon of planetary urbanization. The majority of humanity now lives in cities, and that's been a kind of trend towards urbanization that's been taking place over the last few decades. And we see that 2/3 of the world's cities are in coastal zones prone to floods. This is Houston after Hurricane Harvey. And this is an informal settlement in Lagos in Nigeria. And of course, it's not just coastal zones that are being affected by climate change, although I talk a lot about flooding, and a lot of my book is based in New York City and the experience of Hurricane Sandy. Of course, flooding is also an issue in cities connected to rivers. Most cities have rivers going through them because they were established so that they could connect to transportation. And then, of course, there's also the issue of heightened temperatures that I alluded to earlier when I showed you the heat island effect. So what's going on here? Why is this urbanization process happening, and how is capital and capitalism related to it? Well, cities are obviously key to globalization over the last 40 or 50 years. We don't often think about globalization in terms of boats. We usually think of airplanes when we think about globalization, but actually the invention of containerization and container ships has been key to globalization. And what that means is that port cities have grown tremendously over the last 50 years. And as you might imagine, the vast majority of port cities are in low-lying coastal areas and are places that are extremely vulnerable to various aspects of climate change. Slide disappeared, but maybe it'll come back later. So why do we keep building here in these dangerous places? Well, cities, in addition to being really important parts of the contemporary global capitalist economy, are also sites where over-accumulated capital can be invested, reinvested in real estate. leading to things like gentrification and displacement, but also to building in places that is pretty insane, in waterfront areas. And in the book, I talk a lot about the redevelopment of New York City under Mayor Bloomberg, who rezoned about a third of the city, and much of that was in former industrial areas right along the coastline, like Long Island City or Williamsburg. So we get building, often of very expensive luxury condominiums, in places where building shouldn't really take place, in flood zones. And probably the most really telling example of the irrationality of all of this is Miami Beach, right? This is an article from Scientific American sort of asking why we keep building along the coast in a place like Miami Beach, which is so highly vulnerable. And when we start thinking about cities and capitalism, of course, that raises questions about inequality. Cities are the site of, sorry, that's where the slide went. I knew it would come back. Here you get a sense of globalization, right? And some of the cities, which according to an OECD study from a few years ago, are the most threatened in terms of economic assets. Of course, the picture changes when you look at numbers of people threatened, but they're not entirely distinct because as these places have developed, they've also attracted a lot of people to them. So you get a sense of how the global economy has developed and how much of it has been about coastal port cities. But capitalism has been driving the growth of cities which are extremely unequal. New news, of course, we know, particularly since the Occupy movement, that we have galloping, uneven growth, but a lot of it is situated in cities. That means we need to think about cities in ways that are quite differentiated rather than thinking about them as homogeneous wholes. And again, often the tendency when we talk about, for instance, carbon emissions, I mean, you remember that slide I showed of New York City's carbon emissions and the bubbles piling up around the Empire State Building. Well, cities are highly unequal spaces socioeconomically, and they're also unequal in terms of the amount of carbon being generated in different parts of them, and of course the vulnerability to climate change impacts. To give you an example of this, this shows the total annual energy consumption in New York City. I'm sure you can recognize this is Manhattan with Central Park in the middle, and then here you have Queens, and at the south of the image, Brooklyn. And not surprisingly, Manhattan is where the most energy has been consumed and consequently where the most carbon emissions are being generated. A lot of that has to do with the centers of kind of corporate midtown and downtown, but even in other areas, like the Village, Gramercy Park, et cetera, there are very affluent populations who consume a huge amount of energy. And so it's no kind of surprised that when you look in the areas where the public housing projects are around here, the energy consumption goes down, and then when you get to the less affluent outer boroughs, again, you see the energy consumption and carbon production goes down. So, we see here the ways in which cities are highly uneven. How does this all play out in Philadelphia? I haven't studied Philadelphia in detail, so I'm really looking forward to the kind of conversations that we're going to have in what will follow. And I'm very interested in what you all will have to say about Philadelphia and how some of these dynamics play out. I must say, though, it's great to be visiting Philadelphia, and that the mayor here, as you may know, has been saying some of the right things. Last summer, as the Trump administration backed out of the Paris Agreement, the mayor said, I'm quoting him, "Since the White House has opted to step away from its obligations to this issue, all cities, including Philadelphia, must step up. The hotter, wetter, more extreme weather brought by climate change disproportionately harms our city's most vulnerable residents." So, stressing the importance of cities and the pivotal role that they can play in addressing climate change as the federal government tries to do exactly the opposite. And then the ways in which vulnerability is disproportionately affecting people who are economically and socially vulnerable. Snagged a couple of maps off the internet to think about some of these issues. This is Philadelphia with FEMA flood zones. I guess this is the Schuylkill, and these are some of the flood zones along the edges of the city. And then here's a census image of income. So it might be interesting to talk about whether there's any correlation in terms of vulnerability and this kind of differential impacts. Philadelphia is also the 100th city to sign on to the 100% clean energy pledge, which the Sierra Club has been backing. Its overall target is to transition to 100% renewable energy by 2035. But just to sound a bit of a critical note, and again, I'm an outsider, so I'm looking forward to the conversation and hearing from all of you. But I did find that the deputy director of the Office of Sustainability of the city clarified that the 2035 goal date is just a goal. She said, while we're being aspirational and setting the goal of 100% clean energy, we're still working to understand what it would take to meet that goal within a specific time frame. So, you know, a little bit of kind of political dancing around and lack of clarity there. So it'll be interesting to think about that. And it's also, I think, really important to hold politicians' feet to the fire because if New York City is any kind of guide, the idea of cutting carbon emissions can be somewhat deceptive because there's often quite striking pronouncements about how much carbon emissions have been cut. But if you start to look into it, there are reasons to be skeptical because it usually has to do with a switch from highly polluting oil, heating buildings with highly polluting oil, to heating with liquid natural gas, which emits much less carbon, but is a fossil fuel. It's actually methane, although liquid natural gas sounds touchy and feely and like it's a great thing. That's what the industry wants us to think about. Nonetheless, it's a fossil fuel. So the question of what to do next after this transition, that's when the hard stuff really starts, right? And that's where politicians really need to be pushed, I think. So I'm looking forward to discussing some of those issues. And I think in addition to pushing politicians on an urban level to have really progressive climate action plans that have a 100% decarbonization goal that has really clear steps, with the big steps not happening at 2050 or some very distant date, I think it's really worthwhile to have other instances of climate action plans. The university, I know, the University of Pennsylvania has one that's really interesting and worth looking into. I don't know if we'll discuss that, but I'd love to hear from some of you if you have thoughts about it, critical or celebratory. And then I think it's also really important to back community-based climate action plans, because in my mind, that's often where the most progressive policies get proposed and where the pressure on politicians can come from. So I'm going to close by very quickly just showing you a few slides from the Harlem-based environmental justice organization We Act. They published a climate action manual for northern Manhattan. You can find it on the web. This is a kind of very abbreviated version of it, which takes basically 2 pages, but it's been since built out and is about 60 pages, so it's detailed and really interesting. And it has some of the sort of most progressive components about adapting to climate change, particularly to storm surges that affect New York, such as coastal wetland restoration and providing forms of storm surge absorption that are also community recreational spaces. But there are also lots of other, I think, very far-seeing components. Another one of them is cooperatively owned renewable energy microgrids, which can create power resiliency, since if the grid in the whole city goes down, as happened during Hurricane Sandy, the microgrids can be islanded and keep providing power, and that's a huge issue in a city like New York, where water doesn't flow above 5 stories when electricity is not working, so it's a really life and death issue. And these kinds of efforts can also provide community jobs and income, maintaining and installing solar panels. Other elements have to do with community farms to deal with the food desert issue, and land trusts so that communities control the land and can't be pushed out by gentrification. Community spaces so that people can have a site of harbor in the event of a storm, but can also connect with one another. Seeing networks, social networks, as a really important element of resiliency. affordable co-op housing, and community banks and participatory budgeting to support all of that. So there's a lot of really interesting ferment going on at the grassroots. And in my mind, environmental justice organizations are really at the forefront of leading the fight back and pushing politicians to come through on their pledges and to adopt the far more aggressive pledges that we need them to. Obviously, we face a pretty dire future unless we begin to act more aggressively. This is an article from The Guardian published right before the latest United Nations climate conference, talking about the fact that none of the countries of the world have actually kept to their voluntary pledges in Paris 2 years ago. They're all failing and emitting more carbon. But even if they did keep to those pledges, we would be on track for a 3-degree world. And what does that mean for the cities of the world? Well, it means massive inundation for many of those coastal cities that I showed you. Displacement of, hundreds of millions of people. Obviously, this will change as more people move there, but the Guardian article talks about 500 million by 2100. And just to bring it home to the United States, the inundation of the bottom third of Florida. And the article doesn't even talk about what's going to happen to the Mississippi Delta. So we are faced with really grave conditions. And as Jim pointed out at the outset, the world that we know is going to change very radically and faster. So this is obviously terrifying, but I think it's also an opportunity to mobilize and to figure out how to be in solidarity with one another to make a new and a better world. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to talking to Daniel and to being in dialogue with all of you. Thank you again for coming out and for listening.
OK, great. Hi, everybody. I think I'm on. Yeah. Later, I'm going to show you a really cool and frightening map of Philly. But we're going to actually save that for the Q&A, because I don't want to associate myself uniquely with being scary. So it's great to be here. I feel like having your body on display at an anthropological museum, especially in the basement, is a kind of rare honor. OK, so the great Colombian novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez said famously that he had borrowed his novelistic method from his grandmother, who would tell these fantastical stories with a face like a brick. And this is what magical realism was like. But this wasn't actually just about making things up. As Penn's own Erica Beckman wrote, it is often modernity itself, and particularly the forces of capitalism, that are presented as supernatural and inscrutable. And they're presented that way, of course, because that's how they're experienced in a context like Colombia. So in a certain way, Extreme Cities also tells a fantastical and frightening and magical story about the future. It's not every day that we think about tomorrow with categories like disaster capitalism. Sorry, that would be more not as extreme. Categories like disaster communism, categories like climate apartheid, thinking about red-lined neighborhoods of people in color abandoned to the rising seas, or thinking about small communities ultimately rebuilding the global economy from the ground up, as we do in Extreme Cities. But these are the choices that we're faced with, and I think Dawson, or Ashley, I should say, since you're here now, and we've known each other for 10 years, Ashley makes a really compelling case that the magical thinking is actually the kind of neoliberal urbanists who want us to believe that by tinkering with zoning laws and loving innovation, that's all we need to do, and everything is going to be fine. And you could think about Ed Glazer, but you could think about 10 million other examples of this, these kind of city booster types, often featured in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And they just want to cruise into the future in an automated Tesla with a bright smile. And if you believe in that, you're in the wrong place. So Dawson clears out this garbage, which is great. And in addition to this, I think, kind of echo of magical realism, he also draws on the best traditions of critical theory. And it's an almost surreal experience reading the book, because what Ashley does is in chapter after chapter, he tells you about things and kind of weaves a tapestry that seems incredibly appealing. So it could be about resiliency. It could be about wartime planning during the New Deal era. It could be about Dutch ingenuity in all kinds of different places. And then he weaves this tapestry, and then he's like, oh, I'm just going to pull a couple of these threads. The whole thing falls apart, and then he actually weaves you another story, which is fantastic. Still, in the best traditions of magical realism and critical theory, there is a lot of productive ambivalence, I think, in the book. And so I just want to press on 3 issues, and I think then we can get up and talk, that are of interest not so much to the book, as such, but even really to think about climate politics and what we can do in this moment. So the first area of ambivalence, I think, is the problem of charismatic megastorms, to riff on this idea of charismatic megafauna that environmentalists worry about. So this is a book that is really mainly about storms and extreme weather devastating cities. Ashley's already writing a book about clean energy, so it's not that he didn't notice. But this is still a book where inequality is really sort of talked about in terms of the things that climate change will do to us. And I'm a carbon hawk, and all I worry about is that we're going to focus on the effect and not the cause. But Ashley makes a strong case that actually, if you're thinking about the built environment in the next 100 years, you have to think about radical amounts of kind of resettlement, strategic retreat from coastlines in the United States and, of course, in many other countries. And this entails a massive, massive, massive endeavor to transform how we live. And to think about that kind of change and radically overhauling our energy system in like 20 to 30 years, which is more than twice as fast as the fastest energy transition, is a huge task, and I think a narrative challenge. And so Ashley's book speaks often about the kinds of things he showed you as well, building efficiency, community power, and so on. But I think the charisma of the book and the way that it brings you to think about inequality in such a visceral sense really derives from talking about extreme weather in cities. And I think we do have to ask and wonder and work on really connecting the story of adaptation, which is responding to these changes, and mitigation, or simply just getting rid of carbon emissions quickly. So I think that Ashley's book really does do that, but this is, to me, a source of like endless challenge in the world of climate storytelling, and so I think it'd be great if we could talk a little bit about how this focus on disaster, which really depresses us, can also still lead us into a productive place. I've made the choice to wake up every morning determined that we can solve the climate crisis. Science and technology agree with me. Nevertheless, many people that I know don't have such good luck, but I want us to all be in that place. Okay, the second tension is a tension around this like famous old phrase, small is beautiful. So again, in this kind of dialectical method, I think Ashley takes us back and forth between two different ideas. One is that disaster communism is fundamentally about community action. So we saw the slide about the WEAC's fantastic proposal for Harlem. We learned a lot about Occupy Sandy, which was a massive effort to do relief work in New York City after Hurricane Sandy. This was essentially like bootstrap volunteers who put FEMA and the Red Cross and so many other groups to shame by just completely out-organizing them, not in a competition, but simply delivering aid to people more quickly. At the same time, it's obvious, and Ashley says over and over, grassroots groups alone cannot affect the kind of transition that we need. We are already seeing like world elites, never mind anybody else, talking about 20, 30, $40 trillion spent in the next 20 years on the clean energy transition and on adaptation. And there is no community group that can spend that kind of money on its own. And of course, there are many places in this country and in other countries where you have extraordinary community kind of political infrastructure, but there are many places where you don't. And I think this raises a question of, in a sense, where you're going to err, because I don't want to be unfair to Ashley. He paints us a very sophisticated picture of a kind of dialectical, top-down, bottom-up model of governance. But in the sense of what do we do tomorrow, we have to make choices, and those of us on the left look at a week and the potential things we could do in our evenings, right? The famous quote that socialism takes too many evenings and the meetings and all that. But now a real challenge between essentially the Bernie-crat wing of the Democratic Party versus kind of grassroots community action that is often in tension with that or critical of that, holding people's feet to the fire. But there's still fundamentally a question of like, what should we do as individuals? And politically, are we willing to err on the side of the state, on the side of huge corporations like Siemens, which are going to come in and build you a ton of wind turbines, but might also be so aggressive that you would have a group in Ontario called Mothers Against Wind Turbines, who are resisting this kind of corporate land, which is the same thing really as Blockadia, resisting oil or gas. So there are these really difficult decisions about navigating the tension between big and small, and I think this book gets us a long way toward it, but I want to press Ashley even more on how he thinks about that tension. I don't think there's an obvious answer, but I feel like I understand the kind of the tension between them a lot better than I did before. Okay, the last thing I want to raise is more of a curiosity than a tension. I'm reading a great science fiction book, or I just finished it this morning. Congratulations, Daniel, called The Three-Body Problem. Which is great. I would recommend it to everybody. But I'm going to call this like the body-planet problem. So Ashley has worked on art exhibits. He's hosted artists at CUNY. He is himself an English professor. In the book, talks a lot about some of the really interesting museum exhibits that have been put on about cities. And it strikes me that this is a book that does really connect like the body to, as Ashley says, planetary urbanization. And I'm interested in hearing, Ashley, a bit about how much of the choice to focus on cities is political, how much of it is narrative, and to what extent you see those as being the same thing. So I made this reference earlier to like how despondent we can be about climate change. I'm a reader, but I'm kind of a critic of cli-fi, science fiction about climate change, because I think that compared to the dystopias like 1984 or Brave New World that appeared in the post-war period when everybody felt that things were going to be great and they said, no, they're not. Now, the common sense of our generation, my generation, and those younger than me, and of course others, is that we are doomed. That's just the baseline expectation. So to come in and say, wow, here's a movie about a train, everybody's like really screwed, you're like, oh, I've been on the subway, thanks. Like, that's really, really helpful, shocking news. So we know that, and the problem then is to think, like, what is the connection between my body and my mind and my soul, and these things are obviously the same. What is the connection between that and this like planetary process? And I think there is a strong argument, and actually you make it really that the city is the place where those two are fused. You also, as you were speaking at the end of your presentation, refer to the fact that just because cities are that thing, it doesn't mean that city governments are always the deciders that are going to make the biggest difference. A lot of urban politics is actually made from elsewhere. So, Amitav Ghosh has written this beautiful book, The Great Derangement. He's really put the question of climate storytelling on the forefront. I brought up Garcia Marquez because I think Ashley has written in many ways a kind of novelistic book about like our bodies and the world, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you think in the narrative sense about the decisions that you made in telling the story. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to show in a couple minutes a really scary graph about Philadelphia, but first let's get these chairs out, give Ashley a chance to respond to this like long series of provocations. So thank you for this wonderful book, Ashley, and you should all read it. Yeah.
Thanks so much for those questions. I'm certainly not going to get to everything you asked, but I'll think about them. They're really fascinating, and I really appreciate your deft and light touch in asking them. But let me take a stab at some of the issues that you've raised. So, one of the things that I really enjoyed doing in the book was, as you sort of said, weaving a tapestry and then picking it apart. And one of the places that I found that to be most interesting to do was to think about proposals for adaptation, right? So you have a disaster. You know that often, from Naomi Klein, after a disaster, there's disaster capitalism that happens. But even in instances where there are efforts to think very progressively about changing cities, there's often some problems in the proposals, right? So I go through the resiliency by design competition in New York City, which has since become national and even global. It's an effort to, instead of just put up seawalls or some kind of barriers against storm surges, to use forms of living infrastructure, like wetlands, for instance, as forms of adaptation. And those proposals were often done through consultation with community groups, right? So it was really interesting to look at those efforts, and I think there was a real attempt there to marry mitigation and adaptation. But all too often, I found that there were problems with them, that they didn't include portions of the city, sometimes even portions of the city right next to where the proposed adaptation was taking place. So the issue of inequality kept raising itself as a problem in a lot of the proposals for adaptation. And I think that question is where I kind of come back to your two second questions, in the sense that I wanted to tell stories about solidarity because it seems to me that the major narratives we have about climate change and about disasters are extremely racist. They come from Hollywood. They tend to imagine these kind of desert-like conditions along the lines of Mad Max, where you have a kind of Hobbesian war of all against all, and usually the person who wins out is a straight white man who has some sidekicks and saves the day, right? And so that's how sort of disaster and futurity are imagined, I think, often by climate change, by Hollywood, and that tends to be the kind of dominant imagery of climate change. So, I wanted to tell stories that offered an alternative perspective about social solidarity, and that's where I use that scary term, disaster communism. Not because I'm a Maoist, but because I think that the possibility of grassroots connection really needs to be valued. But in that chapter, I also want to stress how, as you pointed out, Daniel, that often isn't enough, and how pressure has to be put on the state. And I talk specifically about the problems post-Sandy in New York City with organizations like Occupy Sandy getting marginalized in different neighborhoods in different ways. So to kind of come around to your question, I think that cities offer, and I think this is something that you're writing about, a potentially exciting place for forging new solidarities. Solidarities around environmental justice, but then connections between people working on environmental justice and housing, and seeing how those two things are integrally connected to one another, and how efforts at mitigation, such as putting up a solar panel, can also be something that provides jobs and an income for communities, and even forms of self-determination for communities. And those very efforts can then put more pressure on the state. And I gave an example at the end of my presentation, but just earlier this month, there was another wonderful example of this kind of thing, where the really strenuous efforts to get New York City to divest its pension funds finally won out. And I testified at a meeting held in November by New York City's public advocate Tish James in favor of divestment, and saw a lot of the people who I had interviewed for my book, and thought, wow, this is great. This is a really good kind of start. Maybe in like 10 years this will result in something. And then 1 month later, Mayor de Blasio said, oh, we're going to totally divest New York City's pension funds, and by the way, we're also going to take the top 5 oil companies to court for the willful destruction they have caused and will cause on our island city. So yeah, I think cities are places where we can imagine powerful solidarities potentially, and where we can put a lot of pressure on the state in its more kind of local and scaled down kind of level. And because of that, there are also possibilities for representation that are exciting. For too long, cities have been places where we imagine destruction and disaster taking place, but I think we need to also think about them as places for community building and for really dynamic social movements. So I think there's a lot of kind of representational, in both senses of the term, possibility in urban lives and politics. So as I said, I'm sure I didn't get a lot of what you asked. They're fascinating questions, and I'll keep thinking about them. But yeah, I think that's my effort to respond to some of them.
Great, thanks. That's fantastic. I'm going to ask you a couple more questions, then we're going to open it up.
Great.
So I'm not a Philly expert, because I've only moved here, as you know, a year and a half ago. But I'm still going to ask you a question about Philly that I looked up. I was going to find this map on the internet, but it didn't work.
Okay.
That's fine, because I already wrote down what it shows. So there's a great website called Climate Central, and they have a fascinating feature called Surging Seas Carbon Choices, which shows you side by side how much of a city is going to be flooded based on whether we warm by 2 degrees Celsius, which is considered the guardrail, and at this point probably what we're aiming for. We'll say 1.5, but let's be honest. But it should be 1.5, but I think 2 we would be lucky, and 4, which is completely plausible by 2100. Okay, so by 2100, if we warm by 2 degrees Celsius, what will be underwater in Philadelphia? The airport, South Philly up to Snyder, a lot of Eastwick, Roosevelt Park. You stay dry in West Philly, actually. The stadium where the Philadelphia Eagles play, Lincoln Financial Field, done. 2 degrees Celsius. The Eagles are going to North Philly. At 4 degrees Celsius warming, you lose a significant number of the restaurants where many people in this room go to eat. Southwest, beyond Eastwick, you then get fingers of flooding, permanent flooding, up until Woodland. In South Philly, Passyunk west of Broad, underwater. East of Broad, up to South Street in many cases. Bella Vista, half underwater. Queen Village, half underwater. Italian Market, of course, underwater. Old City, Society Hill to some extent. Northern Liberties, Fishan, and Kensington, all underwater. So this is like hipsters in bathing suits, 365 days a year. And those of you, many of you I'm friends with, smug West Philly homeowners, you made a good choice. the question is like, so one, I don't think that many people know this. And it is then, I mean, the problem is that it's so hard to both know what's coming and not just be despairing about it. And I guess my question to you, and this comes around to this narrative question, is like, how much does it matter the facts that people know, and how much does it matter the way they're like politically mobilized? I think about Philly's most exciting recent election is Larry Krasner, who's a DA, but he brings together a kind of novel coalition of professionals and working class and labor leaders. And so, Occupy Sandy, of course, comes with Occupy Wall Street, which wasn't a climate protest at all. So I guess it's sort of like a two-part question, which is like, does knowing more really matter? Is that the priority? And then, what can you tell us from what you've seen in your research? Because you also talk about Miami, where people know, and it just makes no difference. What can you tell us from your research about the rise of a climate justice movement that doesn't start as a climate movement at all, but starts as something else?
Yeah, well, I do think it's important to get people to know. And, obviously, as an environmentalist, as I'm sure you know, you feel kind of cursed, right? A kind of Cassandra, particularly in our country, where, unlike most other countries, the climate denial industry has been so incredibly successful, right? So we have to fight about what science is and what's really happening in a way that's ridiculous. But yeah, just communicating this stuff can often be a real downer. And there's been some scholarship on the danger of catastrophe fatigue, right? With people burning out and not being interested in thinking about these things anymore. But I feel critical about that, and I feel that it's really important to keep thinking about these issues, to keep talking about the realities as much as we know them, and to even emphasize how problematic the science is and how it may be much worse than a lot of what the science is projecting because of the way in which scientists are political creatures and tend to lowball their figures for fear of getting something wrong and getting attacked for it. And specifically, and this comes back to some of your earlier sort of trio of questions, I think it's important to think about this stuff because disaster isn't always just some sort of spectacular one-off like a typhoon or a hurricane, but it's also a slow-moving feature of climate change. And particularly that's the case when we start to think about what's happening to cities and how we might need to retreat from portions of cities. And, when you hear southern Florida is going underwater, you think about evacuating that whole portion of the state. But if you start to think about, well, what should we be doing in Miami right now, thinking about the next decade or 2 decades or something like that, then I think the kind of information that you were talking about Philadelphia and other cities like Miami is really important, right? Because we want to think about retreat from certain portions of the city and how we can do it in a way that's equitable, right? And that might seem really difficult thing to contemplate, but I think it's important to acknowledge that the policies we have right now are terrible and are doing exactly the opposite of what we need. So we have a national flood insurance program which pays people to move back to threatened coastal areas and actually pays the 1%. Right? It's very disproportionately weighted to benefiting wealthy people to rebuild their mansions, their second or their third houses in coastal areas, right? So we need to have this kind of information if we're going to be able to fight for equity and to make sure that as we do need to adapt and move out of certain portions of cities, we do it in a way that's fair and equitable, and that we have the plans that are necessary to make that happen.
Great. I'm going to ask you one more question before we open up to the audience, but I have notes for it over here. So
Okay.
I'm really bad at managing my personal belongings. So, I mean, and I love, because what's so great about this book is it's not that it's a book that is like 4/5, like so many of these books, here's why everything's doomed, 1/5, like long shot solution. The fight back is all the way through. And you have climate apartheid, and then you have disaster communism. But even all the way throughout, there are stories of a live political struggle in which winning we can contemplate and we can see it, and we see the path toward avoiding the worst of climate change always being that path is always being cleared by movements like right now. Not just by movements, but also by movements. So you talked about this horrible thing in the US, unlike most of the rest of the industrialized world, where we're fighting just over climate science. So I'm going to get you with this Trump science question before we open it up.
Oh, no.
So we have 2 special guests here, Sydney Ozer and Brad Starnes, hopefully I got your names right, from the American Federation of Government Employees, which is an awesome union. And it's the EPA local in particular. And so, if you guys put up your hands. So if anyone wants to talk to them after the talk, that would be great. They are sort of raising the alarm about what is going on in terms of people's public health and drawing attention to things that are going on. Scott Pruitt is testifying, I believe, later this week, so we're trying to kind of get people to know really what's happening. Also just came out today, the Union of Concerned Scientists is suing Scott Pruitt for kicking informed experts and scientists off of advisory boards. So there is like a lot going on, and I think there is this bizarre, maybe double-edged quality to the focus on science right now, because as you say, that there's a sort of charisma to that as well, like a charisma to defending like the truth against falsehood, but that's also not the same thing as defending a realistic, politically aggressive coalition-building plan, because you get stuck debating like what is the nature of peer review or something. So as we kind of come into this Trump moment, and you have people on the streets, March for Science, March for Women, and so on, I mean, where would you want people to focus thinking about climate change and coalition building and the most useful kind of immediate next steps?
I think in the United States, of course, we have a disproportionate responsibility. We're the center of global capital and the sole remaining superpower. So what we do has an outsized impact. I think that as environmental justice and climate justice activists here in the US, it would be good for us to call for embargoes of various different kind, boycotts against the United States, given what the Trump administration is saying, and I know that some people have talked about that, but there's no kind of mechanism yet. But, the idea of ostracizing the United States for its current stance, at least on a federal level, I think could be a really important stance, particularly if US activists are saying that kind of thing. More immediately, though, I mean, I think it's really important, of course, to fight Trump. The struggle against new fossil fuel infrastructure seems, and the kind of nonviolent aspect of that, which, of course, was so powerful during the tail end of the Obama administration at Standing Rock, continues. And if people are not involved in that, I would urge you to consider getting involved. Right? Philadelphia has a gigantic refinery, and there are all sorts of pipelines that are coming through Philadelphia, bringing fracked oil and gas. And so there are lots of opportunities for direct action in the city and support of fence-line communities, front-line communities close to the refineries that are affected by that kind of pollution. More long-term, as I pointed out earlier, I think it's great to push organizations and institutions of every different scale and sort to come up with climate action plans. So wherever you're connected, I would say you should be pushing your organizations to come up with very far-seeing and kind of resiliency-building plans for climate action, and resiliency in the sense not just of kind of environmental, but also of social, right, and making those connections, as you stress in your work, Daniel. And then kind of the even bigger kind of picture, like waging the fight on an ideological level. I think it's really important to challenge the idea that the market is going to take us, and that capitalism is going to take us where we need to go, right? Because as odious as the Trump administration is, I think it's important to point out that the Obama administration really sandbagged international efforts to move forward on climate mitigation plans, and that Obama's Clean Power Plan, while it was better than nothing, or supportive, coal, which is what we've got now, certainly was not enough, right? And it was very much framed by a lot of the kind of neoliberal market-oriented ideologies which have been dominant in discussions of climate, for a few decades, right? So I think in terms of like what intellectual work we can do, I think we need to really push back against that and say we need to mobilize for a public-led transition that's happening at all different scales. And that might sound totally utopian, but it's worth keeping in mind that, going back to the Bernie-crat thing, Bernie's campaign led to the adoption by the Democratic Party in its platform, which of course was ultimately unsuccessful, but at least they adopted the idea of a World War II-style mobilization to completely change the country's infrastructure and shift it away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So, we came very close to that being some kind of official policy. Whether it would have actually been implemented, of course, is another debate. But the fact that people are talking about these kinds of things, and that the kind of neoliberal ideology, which has been crushing us for so many decades, is beginning to shake, I think is really important. And of course, I think that the victory of Trump is an index of how unstable the political situation is right now. And of course, we want to shift it from going towards kind of neo-fascism towards, really progressive social solidarity. And I think that that's possible.
That's right, yeah. Thanks so much. That's such a great answer and so acute. And I always just like to throw in, green capitalists are talking about so many trillions of dollars they want to spend. Like the next money is coming for the green economy. And so that is like, there's a world to win in terms of the hegemony over how those investments are made and who's in charge. So let me open it up now to the room. So yeah, if you'll just throw up your hand and then we'll just maybe take 2 or 3 at a time. Yeah, in the back there.
Few weeks in the Pennsylvania legislature, shockingly with some bipartisan support, in the House and Senate of Pennsylvania is going to be a 100% renewable bill. And so you should contact your legislators if you live in Pennsylvania and tell them that you think it's a great idea. I also happen to have a petition, so I'm shilling. But I think that is interesting information.
Yeah, great.
First, Professor Dawson, thank you very much for writing Extreme Cities and also for writing Radical Extinction. I have to say I recommended that book to a book discussion group I'm part of, and that helped a lot of people who are well-meaning, progressive, concerned, begin to move beyond looking for neoliberal solutions to these problems and seeing that, turning to the Democrats isn't necessarily what's going to help us to find this long-term sustainable solution. And certainly I think Extreme Cities will follow in that vein. So let me push a little bit at the last answer that you gave to the question, and that is how we move to that non-capitalist society. I've been doing environmental work for years with the Greens, with the Sierra Club, for decades really, and with other groups. And the question always comes up when you say that capitalism is the problem that we end up hitting. Well, what do we do? Do we have a revolution to another society first? Do we try to reform capitalism into something better? And almost without exception, wherever I go with environmental groups, with university people, they stop at that point. They don't have an answer for that. And I think until we get an answer, we're going to be stuck, because we obviously can't wait for a revolution, but can we also wait to try and do this within the confines of a neoliberal capitalist society, which is leading us deeper and deeper into the problem. Right. So how do you see that transition coming, given the need to deal with things immediately, but also to move beyond those immediate temporary responses to build a new society while we are also dealing with a crisis? It may be impossible. It may not be possible to do that. But I'm interested to see what your thinking has been on that.
Okay, thanks. And then we had one more up front here. Yeah.
Is there anyone from Philly Thrive here? Philly Thrive is a mostly millennial group that was instrumental in stopping the expansion of the refinery. I wanted to take this chance, speaking of mobilization, just very briefly to suggest, after our discussion, that if you want to hear about, I can tell you about Philly Thrive. Mitch Tannen in the back can tell you about 350's campaign to stop a fossil fuel plant in Nicetown, who's in the back there. And I can tell you about the Earthquaker Action Team and Power, who has a campaign to persuade PECO to commit to 20% rooftop solar by 2025, creating 2,700 long-term jobs. So if you want to hear about those after our discussion, feel free to talk to us. Thank you.
Right, you want to speak to these?
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you, the two activists who spoke out about things that are happening. It's great to hear about the movement going on in the city, and you guys in so many ways occupy such an important kind of node, right? Being in Pennsylvania itself with the Marcellus Shale and then the site of all these refineries and pipelines. It's a really kind of crucial point. So it's really great to hear about the work that you're doing here. In terms of your question about, how do we square the question of a kind of dysfunctional capitalist system, but a still dominant capitalist system, right? We had the 2000, 2007, 2008 crisis of neoliberalism, where obviously it wasn't working, and yet it just kind of keeps going on, right? It's a system which prevails despite the fact that ideologically it's clearly bankrupt and not functioning. And the same is definitely true in the environmental realm. I guess what I would say is, first of all, that we shouldn't be shy about making very hard-hitting arguments about the ways in which capitalism, which is a system based on ceaseless compound growth, right? Capitalism has to have about a 3% annual compound growth rate, or else it goes into crisis. How that system is not really possible or sustainable in any kind of long-term basis on a finite terrestrial resource base, right? And how we're seeing those contradictions pile up, particularly when we start talking about climate change. But that's just one of the many things that are going into crisis. Climate change is one of the most well-known, but there's a crisis of the phosphorus cycle, which not that many people think about, but which is absolutely essential to agriculture, right? So there are a lot of ways in which the system we're in is bankrupt and in crisis, and I think we should not be shy about emphasizing that, right? I mean, think about the fact that our current dominant system, ideologically and politically, neoliberalism, spent many decades in the woods, where it was basically, Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek and like 2 or 3 of their friends getting together in a hotel room in Switzerland and plotting taking over the world. And then, whoa, it actually happened, right? So, I think it's important to make the hard-hitting arguments, but then also to be thinking strategically and politically. And I guess I would say that it seems to me, you mentioned the Sierra Club and other kind of more established environmental movements. I think there are shifts that we can see going on within those more established movements. They had a very kind of inside the beltway, kind of, connecting with established powers sort of philosophy for many years. And what's been happening in recent years is that they've been really shifting and trying to connect to environmental justice movements, trying to really emphasize issues that are quite critical of racial capitalism and the ways in which racial capitalism is failing communities environmentally. So I think there's movement within the environmental movement, and increasingly at the grassroots, as we just saw from the 2 comments at the outset and at the end, a lot of kind of energy around grassroots nonviolent direct action, rather than sort of trying to engage in lobbying inside the Beltway. So I think that's a really exciting development. And just one other kind of example, the new book I'm writing, as folks mentioned, is about power. In both senses of the term, but specifically thinking about the transition to renewable energy. How can we make sure that that's something that is a just transition, doesn't leave communities behind, provides new jobs, and isn't just some kind of wonkish thing, right, where we're talking about, insulating buildings, as Daniel pointed out in one of his pieces. That's not going to mobilize communities to talk about insulating buildings, although we definitely need to do that. We need to talk about creating decentralized forms of power that lift communities up in all sorts of different ways. And I think there's real pressure happening there. I mean, I don't know about the discussion on the level of the Pennsylvania legislature, but at least in New York State, we've got this revising the energy vision, which Andrew Cuomo started. Not Mario Cuomo. I wish it had been Mario Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo started, and it was initially the energy czar was a Wall Street tycoon, and so as you might imagine, and as Daniel alluded to, it was very kind of oriented around green capitalist ideas and around kind of making money off new renewable energy technologies. But there's been a tremendous amount of pushback, and so now there's support for community cooperative solar projects of various different kinds, just to give one example. So yeah, I think that this kind of grassroots struggle that I'm talking about is making very big and consequential changes in regulatory structures in states and hopefully ultimately in the country.
Thank you. That's right. My favorite number on this is from Germany, actually, that in 2012, 47% of the clean energy generated at that time, which was a significant amount of the German economy, or close to 20 to 30%. 47% of that was from community-owned cooperatives, mostly wind cooperatives. So it does actually, it's not, community doesn't always mean tiny.
Yeah, right. And Germany's got this remunicipalization movement going, with Hamburg and Berlin both taking over their electrical power supplies. So yeah, very exciting developments.
My name's Gavi. I'm a master's student at Penn. I'm one of the founders of Fossil Free Penn and also involved in the environmental movement through Sunrise and Sustain Us and the youth, looking at intergenerational inequity. So since we're at a university, I just wanted to pose the question of how you would advise the young people in the room who are about to enter these job markets and who are working towards breaking down these systems.
Thank you. Yeah, but not long. Yeah.
You may do this already in the book, Ashley, so if it's there, then just elaborate on it. A great deal of the global calculus, when you think about the causes of climate change and global warming, they really focus on per capita consumption patterns. And that's something that was missing in your account of even cities as these spaces where there is that kind of intensive consumption. Because if you start factoring into your kind of thinking the inevitable growth desires of places like India or China, which may be producing vast quantities of carbon emissions, for instance, but on a per capita basis are producing far less than even the less developed parts of the West, then a very different energy calculation begins to emerge. So it might be very well, it's completely necessary for us to be pushing for various forms of climate change mitigation in the United States. But there has to be a sense in which the rest of the globe is now producing crucial elements of what is becoming the damming chain of production and consumption as it expands across the world. So yes, the term for this is capitalism, but I'm wondering whether we should be disaggregating this further to be able to get a better handle on it. And perhaps you do that in your book already.
Yeah, at the very back. Yeah. I really want to overload you here, Ashley, because those are some small questions.
No, yeah. It's good to take a number of them, though.
I was wondering about the connection between moving people as the rivers rise and gentrification, because I know, at least in Philadelphia, which is the only city where I have significant experience, a lot of the people who are in low-lying areas that also have been historically more exposed to environmental pollution and also lower income and often minority areas where people may eventually need to be moved out of the river's way, also have a lot of distrust of the city's planning and major institutions for very good reason, having had a lot of urban redevelopment where entire neighborhoods were taken. So there's, and in a lot of those neighborhoods, people also believe that any kind of positive change will only happen when higher income white people move there, and any kind of attempt to move people out of what is being stated as harm's way is really just a ploy to get them out of their neighborhoods for kind of various projects.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if in any seen cities address that issue that often they've created in a constructive way, or if you have any recommendations for cities doing that.
Okay. Again, I'll answer the questions pretty quickly. They're wonderful questions, as Daniel said. There's multifaceted in so many ways. In terms of sort of thinking about what young people can do, I mean, I would say that all politics is local, and that you, since in so many ways you're emblematic of the problematic and scary future that we've been talking about, have particular power to push for political change in the institutions you're connected to. I mean, we're here at the University of Philadelphia, so what is the University of Philadelphia's climate action plan? Is it moving fast enough? Are some of the problems that I alluded to earlier about sort of, gathering the low-hanging fruit through shifting from oil to natural gas an issue? What's the relationship between the University of Philadelphia and the surrounding community, right? So I think those are some of the kinds of ways which you could engage politically with the institution that you're within and that you have power over at the moment. And then that, I would hope, would help propel you into really wonderful activism once you graduate in one way or another. In terms of per capita emissions, I mean, you're completely right about how that has to be factored in. I guess what I would say is that as people move to cities, and the vast majority of urbanization is going to happen in the Global South, and I do try and talk about Global South cities as well as what's happening in places like New Orleans and New York and Amsterdam, because I want to be very aware of the fact that urbanization is overwhelmingly, in our present moment and in the future, something happening in developing nations. I think the trend is, as people move to cities, that their carbon emissions go up significantly. Why is that, and how can we cope with that? Well, clearly, there are different kinds of cities. We don't want cities to look like Houston. We don't want the American model of sprawl-based urbanization, of automobile and fossil fuel-based urbanization to be the model which is adopted throughout the rest of the world. And we need to push the United States and other wealthy countries to make sure that the pathway to a just transition is in place as much as possible. There is a green climate fund, which was established as part of the United Nations climate process, but it's really not been funded. Hillary Clinton suggested it should be funded with $800 billion. It's only got $100 billion, and I think she basically just pulled $800 billion out of the air as like some big, substantial sounding number. I mean, we know actually there's much more, and I think we need to be talking about climate reparations, right? Because the people of the Global South are not responsible for climate change, going back to your point about per capita emissions, both historically and in terms of contemporary emissions, right? So how do we think about climate reparations to people of the Global South and, people in marginalized communities in places like the United States? And that comes to the final question. I think there's a real threat that communities are facing today in the United States of climate gentrification. That is, when, and I'll talk about where I've thought about this, that's in Miami, right? The wealthiest people live along the coastline, but as the threats to Miami Beach and other wealthy communities become clearer, there's more and more fear among working class and people of color communities who tend not to live along the coastline, but further into the city and the state in the elevated areas, that they'll be displaced because of climate gentrification, as wealthy people try and move away from the coastlines. So how do we cope with that? Well, first of all, it goes back to information and helping people understand so they can politically mobilize, I think. But then it also involves really hard political struggles, right? So it's not in the book, but in an article that I have coming out, I look at the Urban Land Institute's proposals for North Miami, and they basically say there are these communities which are low income, where houses are repeatedly threatened, so let's encourage people there to sell their land and create a kind of one of these living infrastructures. They call it a slough, like a kind of wetland, essentially, where it could be a park when it's dry, and then it could be flooded by some sort of surge so that it wouldn't go into some surrounding communities. And what they propose is to give people who sell their homes in that community access to affordable housing developments built along the sort of elevated land in the spine, the central spine of the state. Sounds good. The problem is that, affordable housing, if you look into it, has not really been affordable because it tends to be pegged to area median income. And in a city like Miami, just as in New York, and I suspect Philadelphia, the fact that there's a 1% population who have astronomically high incomes means that area median income is totally out of reach for the average person, right? And so affordable housing, there has to be a lot of political fighting around affordable housing. But at least there are efforts to think about these questions, and efforts to address the threat of climate gentrification and to address questions of just retreat within cities like Miami. So the conversation is starting, at least, and that's a good thing.
Great. All right, we have time for one last round of questions. Yeah.
Do you see any value for a free market, for elements of a free market or elements of capitalism to actually support or cohere with the type of transition that you're looking toward? Are there any elements that would be beneficial opposed to deleterious.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for speaking. Have you noticed any examples of the ancient past or any other examples like that of significant climate change that have influenced your writing?
We've got one down here.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I'm involved with an eco district project in the Spring Garden section of Philadelphia. It's a community-based design and development oriented approach, and we're doing net positive buildings, and a lot of solutions are coming out of the architecture and design world that I think people need to pay attention to, because our buildings can produce energy rather than consume energy.
Right.
But part of it, the problem, of course, is capital to make it happen. Have you explored some of the alternative currency movements like the Earth dollar that's coming forward, and developing alternatives to the Federal Reserve system, which it is a real question whether capitalism as it is structured will invest to save civilization, and it's odd, so maybe we need a new currency, and there's a lot of initiatives in that area.
Right, thank you. And then since the last round, we'll just take one more from up front here. Yeah, sort of front slash middle.
Did you say median currency? Did you say median currency?
Area median income is the way in which affordable housing is determined. Basically, you just take everyone in an area and average their incomes. But the point is, if you have a few people earning $1 billion, suddenly the average goes. Okay, yeah, sorry. I'm not a scientist or a mathematician, so I may not be getting the terms right, but that's what happens more or less. And I think that's the official classification. So I might not have the math right, but that's the social impact. So I need to look more into it, obviously, but that's the term.
Okay, let's just do one last one up there. Yeah, in the spirit of the unruly democracy that is surging.
To the gentleman's point about the need to disaggregate capitalism further to properly diagnose the problem, if the problem is that as urbanization occurs in the developing world and we increase our per capita emissions, and then we disaggregate that problem, we'll find that maybe that's because people are eating more meat when they move to cities, or that their commuting patterns use more cars. So then would the solution, so why is the solution to dismantle capitalism as opposed to eating less meat and finding alternatives to fossil fuel guzzling transportation?
Okay, some really small questions to end the evening.
It's all softballs in the museum.
I know. Wow, those are really great questions. Let's see. Where to start? Well, I would say that I think I'll start with your question first. Why not just do things differently? Well, I mean, I think the capitalist system is based on infinite expansion. So, there's lots of small peasant agriculture all around the world, but it's no accident that here in the center of the capitalist system, small holding local agricultural production was pretty much dismantled by industrial agriculture, industrial capitalist agriculture, and that we exported that model with the Green Revolution starting in the 1960s. And so we've encouraged the rest of the world to follow this model of capital-intensive, fossil fuel-intensive agricultural production, right? So it's connected to capitalism, and it's connected, frankly, to empire, and to US empire specifically, right? The Green Revolution was called the Green Revolution because it was the antithesis to the Red Revolution, right? And if you look at what happened in many revolutionary situations like the Soviet Union and China, for all of their many problems, one of the key elements was land redistribution, right? So, we now know that peasants are actually far more productive than big industrial farms, and of course they tend not to use tractors and fossil fuels. So, if you're going to say, well, why don't we just kind of tweak the capitalist imperialist system and make it work better? My response would be, this is a system which historically has proven itself to be bent on ecocide. We, of course, need to fight for alternatives as much as possible, and fight to support peasant agriculture and non-meat-eating alternatives. But we need to be very aware of the way in which the dominant system is pushing the world, and to think about the kinds of alternatives that we can make through social movements. And that comes back to the earlier question about markets. Historically, human beings have always engaged in various different forms of exchange. In many cases, they've been around, again, historically around sort of commons. And my new book is going to be called The Energy Commons. So I'm really interested in models of, although as we talked about, I want the state to be pushed in various different ways. I'm interested in kind of decentralized forms of exchange which can happen. But it's clear that we need to have regulation, right, of those markets, particularly given the dominance of powerful corporate interests today. So I don't think there's no place for markets. I've been reading a lot recently about the potential for blockchain, which is behind Bitcoin. Some of you may have heard about blockchain. There was an article in the New York Times magazine just last week about how blockchain works. It can allow peer-to-peer trading of various different kinds. Of course, with Bitcoin, it's about sort of non-state currencies, which I think is what someone was alluding to in that question. But it can also allow peer-to-peer trading of energy, right? So that if you're in a cooperative and there's no room on your roof to have a solar panel, you can still get some of the energy directly from people in your cooperative who have access to solar power. So I think markets could work in various different ways. It's just that we need to make sure that people don't get left behind, people who can't afford to participate in them. For instance, if we're talking about energy, that's a dramatic issue, right? If people can't power their houses, can't keep their heat going, they're going to freeze to death, particularly as we get more extreme forms of weather. So we need to make sure that there's some antithesis to markets and that there are politically progressive movements that are pushing them so that people don't get left behind. So I would say that that's really kind of key to look at. The other question about sort of examples in the past. If you haven't had a chance to look at my book on Extinction, I would love it if you would look at it because it goes through a big, long historical arc talking about the tendencies towards overexploitation of resources historically and how that's happened and how it's played out. And my argument there is that it's really been magnified during the capitalist era. And that's where my critique of capitalism and its relation to extinction comes, right? Because as if everything we've talked about tonight weren't bad enough, it's also important to remember that we're in the midst of the sixth extinction and we're kind of driving all established life forms over the cliff. And a lot of that is connected to the growth of industrialized agriculture around the world, right? So we really have a lot of work to do going forward. Okay.
That's right, we do. So I want to second the endorsement of Extinction as an awesome book. I also loved it. But tonight, Ashley will be signing copies of Extreme Cities just outside. And thank you so much for the talk and for the conversation.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you all.